Mr. President, members of the Society and visitors, it's indeed a pleasure to address you this morning. I'm a little jet lagged, so I brought some smart water with me. We'll see if that works. Increasingly, we're seeing restricted substances, brands, eco-labels, retailers. They want to restrict hazardous chemicals to make sure they are not in their products. We've even seen manufacturers' restricted substances lists that seek to ensure that hazardous chemicals don't get into our process, so they're completely eliminated from the supply chain. Biocides are hazardous materials. They have to be. They need to control living things. This is why governments regulate them. They have a responsibility for the environment. They have a responsibility for their people. And this is why brands and retailers want to restrict them as well, as a function of due diligence for the products that they sell to consumers. But leather and the raw material from which we make leather is a natural substance. Archaea, bacteria, fungi, over millennia, have developed mechanisms to break down polymeric materials, organic materials, to simpler substrates. And this is important. This is necessary for the cycle of life. So how do we balance this need? We do not want our leather raw materials to be broken down until we can convert them into leather finished products. So with that as basis, I want to address just briefly a couple of foundational topics on risk assessment. Briefly, we'll touch on some government regulation, some market restrictions on biocides, and then pose the question, how do we respond to this increasing environment of restriction with the tanner's need for control? Okay, so let's start off with some basics. Hazard is an intrinsic capacity to produce an adverse effect, and risk is the probability of an exposure to a hazard and the likely outcome of that exposure. And let's use as a simple example wind. Now, none of us are really concerned by a small breeze, but if the wind picks up and it gets very strong, we need to take cover, we need to take shelter to protect ourselves from the risk of a very strong wind. With chemicals, we use the term toxicity. Toxicity is the capacity of a chemical to produce harm. And this is a very important point. It's an inherent property of all chemicals. Now, this is a really interesting guy. I love his name, but let's just call him Paracelsus for short. He was a Swiss-German doctor, lived about 500 years ago. He was I'll call him a scientist, though he's probably a little more of an alchemist, but we do know that chemistry has its foundation in the dark arts of alchemy. And he came up with this phrase based on his research work, the dose makes the poison. Now, this is foundational in toxicology, and this curve exists for all chemicals. For all chemicals, from a toxicity point of view, at low levels, they are safe. There's no harm to people or the environment. As you increase the dose, you get increasing effects, including toxic effects. Very important to understand, and let's use an example. In the previous Atkin lecture, arsenic was mentioned. Now, we all know arsenic is hazardous. It's a dangerous chemical. But you know, at some level, below what's determined a no observable adverse effect level, arsenic is no harm. In fact, there's recent studies that show certain species require arsenic as a micronutrient for function. But of course, if you go to higher levels, we do know that it is toxic. Let's use another example at the other end of the spectrum. Sodium chloride, table salt. We think of that as benign. But if you, and sometimes I probably eat a little too much table salt, I love the flavor, but if I sat down and ate a couple of kilos, it'll kill me, right? We also know from our industry, one of the biggest environmental issues we have is salt from our process that enters the environment. So we have the spectrum. We have products which we know or we have a feeling are hazardous, and we have others which we don't think of as hazardous, but this is a fundamental principle. All chemicals are intrinsically toxic. It's really a matter of dose. Very important to understand. And then, of course, if we are assessing risk, we also need to look at duration and timing. We know, for example, you drop sulfuric acid in your skin from a leak in a pipe or a drum or something in the tannery, you wash it off, no problem. You leave it on your skin, you can have a problem. And of course, chemical effect on in utero, on babies, on adults, there are different effects. So in evaluating or assessing risk, we have to look at duration, we have to look at timing. And of course, route of exposure. The fragile membranes in our lungs are very sensitive to certain chemicals, whereas if they're only on the skin, they're not necessarily a problem. But a toxicologist would look at dermal, inhalation, ingestion, eyes. There are other routes of exposure, but we won't, I think for tanning industry, those pretty much cover your main concerns. And then, of course, environmental release. Now, I won't go through all of these, but this is the work of a toxicologist. I know in the United States, it's 7 years of graduate study to be a qualified toxicologist. And really what they're trying to do with the studies and assessing risk of chemical is plot that dose-response curve. And with all of these different testing or endpoints that they develop, they then look at the use of that chemical in different scenarios, and they assess the risk, and then they come out with their decisions of as far as restriction, regulation, based on a clear risk assessment and characterization of risk. Now, some of you eagle-eyed have seen Sex and Politics here, right? Of course. There's a difference in response between male and female to certain chemicals, because biochemically we are different. And politics, unfortunately, of course, depending on the country, some countries will view a certain chemistry different than others because of their geographic landscape, because of their commercial interests sometimes. But yes, sex and politics as well. So this is just a summary. Remember, toxicity is an inherent property of all chemicals. And really what's key is not just the toxicity or the, and we can look at hazard classes, hazard categories, but also the quantity, how much of the chemical is present, and under what scenarios do you have that contact, how much contact with the chemical. So risk is a function of inherent hazard plus level of exposure, and of course it's all about protecting people. And from a sustainability point of view, from the industrial sustainability point of view, the foundational the three foundational elements are people, planet, and profit. Okay, now let's see if you've been paying attention. Biocides are hazardous, they need to be, but we use them in manufacturing because leather will be damaged otherwise. So we should use them responsibly and in a sustainable way. Okay, hands up. With a hazardous chemical, it's better that we use less. Agreed? I see a few hands. Very good. You've not been paying attention. We're talking about sustainability here. It sounds right. It's hazardous. We use less. It's better. But in the tanning industry, we need to use the right amount of biocide to adequately control growth. If you use too little and you get microorganism damage to your leather, you get fungal growth, you damage your product, and potentially mycotoxins from uncontrolled fungal growth can be a harm to people working in the tannery. So the sustainable use of biocides is to use the right amount, optimized amount in the tannery, based on sustainability concepts. Okay, hands up. Greenery is clean. If it's green, it's better to use. Not so many hands now. You're learning. Right, but it makes sense, right? It's more sustainable to use a biocide with a lower intrinsic hazard categorization. Remember Paracelsus? What did he teach us? It's typical that biocides with a less hazardous profile need to be applied in much larger quantities for control. Dose response curve, right? So even though you're using one with a lower risk, you have to use a lot more. Remember arsenic? Remember table salt. They're all toxic. It's a matter of the amount you use. And in reality, the products we should use in the tanneries are those that are properly risk assessed and registered for the application. Okay, enough of the basic principles. Let's move on to government regulation on biocides. Okay, I'm not going to bore you by going through all of this. You can bore yourself on the internet hours at a time. What I'd like to just discuss, which is probably the premier regulation on biocides in the world today, that's the biocidal product regulation. And that's focused on Europe, which is appropriate for our discussion here today. In 1998, the Biocidal Products Directive came into force. In 2000, it was legally applied, and the scope of the legislation was authorization and placing on the market for use biocidal products, the goal to harmonize the European market, because different countries had different legislation. It was complex. And also to provide a high level of protection for humans and the environment through risk assessment. Risk assessment is a scientific process, and this biocidal directive was appropriately using scientific processes. So just looking at the legislation, existing active substances, if they were on the market by May 2000, they could continue to be used. They were grandfathered as such, while a review program looking from a risk assessment point of view would take place. And as long as the dossiers to support those active substances were in place in October 2008. And the leading chemical suppliers have put the dossiers together, and for most of them those are in place, and the review program is ongoing. A question on new active substances, those who come into the market after 2000, it's a little different, because there's no grandfathering clause. The full review, dossier review has to be completed, and it has to be approved before it can be used. So there's that distinction. Within the Biocidal Directive, under Group 2 preservatives, we have references to leather. Product type 9 actually includes the word leather, and there you will find the typical fungicides which we use to preserve leather. I mentioned two other product types 6 and 11, because sometimes you'll have chemicals which are preserved with in-can preservatives which may come into the tannery. And product type 11, there is some discussion with regard to soaking operation. Do we add a bactericide to preserve the leather, or do we add the bactericide to preserve the processing solution in which the leather is processed? And I think this is an important distinction, because when you look at, for example, split hides which go into the food chain, an argument can be made that we're not adding the biocide to preserve the leather or the split, because the food people would be concerned about that. But if we argue that we need to preserve the water in which the food for split is being processed, it's an easier argument for regulators to understand. And I know there's still some discussion on that in Brussels at the moment, and it's an ongoing issue. Also within the legislation is two-tier authorization. You need to, at the European level, have the active substance registered, but then at the national level, individual products need to be registered for use. Okay, so this legislation magically disappeared. The intention was, once by the dossier review, the annex of approved substances would start being populated and should be pretty much completed by 2012. How did they do? There's zero. There's nothing on the approved list. So what does Brussels do? Just as if by magic, they create a different legislation called the Biocide Products Regulation, which came into force in September 2013. Okay, that review process is still underway. The difference between a regulation and a directive is a regulation immediately takes effect throughout the European Union, whereas a directive needs to be applied at country level and incorporated in each country's legal framework. The BPR continues the review program, so those dossiers of information are still under review. Product type 9 leather is probably only going to start review in between 2 and 4 years' time. It still maintains the two-tier authorization of active substance and biocidal product regulation, but the review program is running late. It's extended through 2024. Some important differences from the biocidal product directive. Since they're coming out with new legislation, they did fix a couple of problems with it. One of them is nominated listing. Chemical companies saying, look, we're spending all this money to support actives, what protection is there for us? And now you can only use, according to Article 95, the list of official sources of active substances can be used. You can't use what was potentially on the market in 2000. It has to be supported by a dossier and through a nominative supplier. So the source of actives are listed. And if you want to find out where that is, you can go onto the ECHA website, check that box, and then you can go onto the information on what is on Article 95 approved biocide types and suppliers. And if you go onto the website, this is the kind of information you'll find. I'm not trying to promote TCMTB or our company, just using that as an example. It's the most widely used fungicide. But you'll find it under a particular product type. You should ensure that the biocides are listed and the correct use application is listed. The problem is you can't find that on the website. You can't find that from ECHA. So how do you comply with the legislation if you can't get access to the information? So our suggestion is you get a compliance letter from your supplier. And this again is just an example of a compliance letter from our company stating, yes, it's on product type 9, yes, we are supporting it, and yes, it's for use application level. So that's what you need to do as a tanner to ensure that you are compliant. One of the other aspects of the legislation is the treated article provision, because the argument is if we're going to protect our people from hazardous chemicals being used in Europe, what about articles coming in that may contain hazardous substances we don't want in Europe? So they've exported the regulation to the rest of the world, and this means globally the leather industry, if they export to Europe wet blue finished articles, those articles should only be treated with biocides that are under review within the European Union. I mentioned earlier existing substances and new substances, and this is an example of a new substance. Our company developed a new product called CHED. We cannot sell it in Europe until the complete review is by the European Union is completed, and that will probably be 2022, 24. But in the meantime, it can be used outside of Europe as long as a dossier of support was submitted by September 2016, which we have done. Okay, government regulation, BPR, I think this is the highest standard of risk assessment, scientific based. I have no problem with it. We need to comply with the law anyway, so it's no sense in arguing or being concerned about it. Just understand what your responsibilities are and comply. Let's talk about market restrictions now. Here it becomes a little more complex because it's not just governments, it's also brands and retailers, industry organizations like the automotive industry, GADSL is an example, environmental organizations and activist groups, call them collectively NGOs. They also seek to restrict hazardous chemicals. Why? Corporate risk, industry reputation. They want to share best practice. They want to raise standards in industries. And I think at some level they do have a sincere concern for the environment and for their consumers. And if we look at what restrictions there are on biocides, Some of the eco-labels, for example, or RSLs will just say make sure that the biocide is compliant with prevailing legislation, such as BPR. Other RSLs, and I have no issues with that, I should mention, other RSLs have arbitrary limits on commonly used biocides. And here I have a couple of questions, because I think that a lot of these restrictions have best intentions, but they may not always understand the leather industry and its specific needs well. They may not have expertise in toxicology, might not use a risk assessment approach. The process in putting limits may not be always well defined. Some limits are cut and paste from other industries or other eco-labels. Some of these limits can be secretive, competitive, open to interference. And once in place, the limits, whether they make sense or not, can be difficult to change. And if they are unrealistic, it creates unnecessary technical barriers to trade. Just a couple of comments on some of these limits. And a lot of them, I said, may come from other industries, typically the textile industry. And there is a difference between leather and most textiles. Leather is natural, it's renewable, it's three-dimensional. And when you put limits, they usually extract the biocide with a very strong solvent, whereas if you think from an exposure scenario, which is what we're really concerned about, you're only touching a very small part of the surface of leather. So sometimes the limits that you may find in leather, when you think of it from an exposure scenario, are unnecessarily perceived as excessive. Sometimes these NGOs think, well, we need to restrict, otherwise tanners will use too much of it. You know, I've traveled around the world, I've seen a lot of problems in the leather industry. The problem is they don't use enough, usually. Right? Why? Biocides are very expensive, especially fungicides. They're going to use the minimum amount. And to have a limit which is arbitrary sometimes does not make sense. Why? Because the amount you need depends on the raw material, the process parameters, the end product. One of the things we need to understand about fungicides in particular, we tan leather. Why? To prevent it from being degraded by microorganism enzymes. So why does fungus grow? It's not growing on the leather, it's growing on the fat. And we don't tan the fat. So really the amount of fungicide you need is dependent on the amount of typically natural fat and natural sugars present. It also depends on the insult, the amount of spores in the air. It depends on temperature. Higher temperatures, it will grow a lot more rapidly. And what limits would work for Northern Europe are not going to work in Vietnam or Indonesia or some of those places. Yet these limits by NGOs become global limits. And there's also a lot of other technical issues related to the way that we express fungicides in relation to leather and the way we extract it, which I won't get into here, but there's a lot of other technical issues why I have concerns about limits. And I was in a meeting a couple of years ago in Brussels where eco-label was being discussed. And this is something to me which we, I think, as scientists and technicians need to be very wary of. Because if these bureaucrats sometimes, or well-meaning sometimes people in charge of RSLs, can ask a question which we can't answer, immediate reflex is to invoke the precautionary principle and ban and restrict and limit. I don't think this is scientific. I think the scientific name for this is bullshit. From a toxicological point of view, we look at the landscape of available data. We then use cost-benefit analysis to make informed choices. And typically toxicologists work with safety factors of 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, depending on the robustness and veracity of the data. So if they come up with a limit, you can, believe you me, these are very conservative people. You can be assured that that limit is safe. And remember, Paracelsus. Okay, I won't go into these, but you know, I've just broken it down into NGO-imposed limits. You have eco-labels. These are examples of eco-labels. More and more of concern to me is more textile companies wanting to get involved in the leather industry without understanding the challenges of the tanner. industry organizations, which I've mentioned, and then individual RSL organizations or individual brands. From my point of view, the best practice is biocides should be used in accordance with EU BPR requirements. This represents the highest standard for comprehensive review using scientific risk assessment approach. Now, having said that, I understand that, especially for corporate risk, some brands need or would like to have limits. They'd like to at least have the feeling that there is some control. I understand that. But I think it's responsibility of those of us in the scientific community to push back against some of those limits. And when I say push back, what I mean is educate, inform, negotiate, dialogue. Okay, so industry response, question from the tanneries. Okay, I understand all of this. What should I do? Number one, for best practice, work with a good supplier. One who has the products, processes, and knowledge to ensure performance. Number two, optimize your application. Some tanners may be using too much, some may be using too little. Make sure you're using the right amount for your material, your process, your preservation requirements. Document biocide compliance. It's required by the law. Ensure the active substances are supported under the appropriate product type and for the intended use. And the way you do that is request documentation from your supplier. Also, if you're importing goods, confirm that they are in compliance with the BPR, request documentation. Determine if there are any restrictions on the presence of biocide residuals in the leather you make, because there are RSLs there, or MRSLs, which may impact some of the biocidal products you use. And some of these limits, quite frankly, don't make sense, and this is where I think as an industry we need to again push back. Work with your biocide supplier, industry organizations, and if restrictions are too harsh, let's work together, push back by informing, negotiating with some of these NGO organizations. Thank you for your